الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Hope everyone's doing well. So in our previous lecture we had discussed the fatwa of Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi of giving fatwa on another madhab based upon dharura and haja. So because we're trying to see how different masail when it comes to application, how they operate, there's a few other things that we want to discuss inshallah today, but of course briefly, so we don't have as we don't have that much time to cram a lot of cases in and try to flesh them out in the minimal time. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at three other scenarios that we come across in terms of the application of the Hanafi madhab due to some issue. So we had the original taqsim al-masail in mind, giving fatwa on the madhab, the tabaqat mujtahideen, how to choose between them, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to be looking at are three issues today inshallah. One is where fatwa, where a mas'ala is not found in zahir riwayah, and so therefore a person then how should we interact with that mas'ala? So mas'ala is not found in zahir riwayah, how should one interact with that mas'ala? Or it's not found, or it's found in other riwayat, let's put it that way, and I'll give you an example of that inshallah. Then we'll be looking at the mas'ala which is maskut an. So this is not really giving fatwa to another madhab, it's more to do with the fact that the absence of the mas'ala in the Hanafi madhab. So in our madhab, it doesn't seem to be any clear explanation for this. So therefore, we kind of force to go to another madhab to see what they've got to say, and then act upon it. And then lastly, we'll be looking at the question of implementation of the Hanafi fiqh in terms of qanun. This is a very lengthy discussion, so we'll kind of briefly summarize it and give one example of that, of how the Hanafi law can be used, or how law in general, fiqh in general, is used, or sometimes you can use it manipulated or adapted to fit into the laws of a modern state. So that's what we'll be looking at in today's lecture inshallah. There's a lot of things to go through, so hopefully we'll try to cram as much as possible, and I'll give you further reading alongside that. Right, so the first scenario we're going to try to look at a bit is when a mas'ala is not found in zahir riwayah, but it is found in other riwayat, right? What does a person do in such a situation? Well, the answer seems to be pretty straightforward, but there can be sometimes complications associated with this. So we'll give two examples, both slightly vary, and that's one of the cases. That's one of the issues with case studies, is that every case has their these variants and nuances that one has to kind of keep an eye out for, lest you make a mistake in trying to make false analogies between two masail. So I'll give you two examples for this inshallah. One is the example of the hukm of the lihya, of the beard in the Hanafi madhab. So I briefly, I think, mentioned this in an earlier lecture, which is that the beard, the obligation of which doesn't come in the zahir riwayah, and nor does it come in the nawadir. Right, there's no mas'ala mentioned about the obligation or the permissibility of cutting or shaving the beard. The only thing we find is that in the Kitab al-Athar of Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf, they have some narrations that Imam Muhammad and Abu Yusuf cite from Abu Hanifa. In the Kitab al-Athar, Imam Muhammad, he explicitly says that it's permissible to trim the beard, because he has a chapter heading which is called the chapter of trimming the beard. He cites the hadith Ibn Umar, and he says, so we take this position which suggests the permissibility of trimming the beard. But the tafsil or ta'sil of the mas'ala is not found. And if you remember in the beginning, the Kitab al-Athar is actually not mentioned within the taqsim al-masail. In terms of zahiri riwayah nawadir, the Kitab al-Athar is not found as mentioned amongst them, even though Abu Zahra has said you can maybe attach this to zahiri riwayah. But anyway, whatever the case, there isn't any explicit wujub even. So if you take the Kitab al-Athar as being from the Zahiri or Nawadir, it doesn't mention the obligation. Now the obligation seems to stem from a statement mentioned by Imam Abu Bakr Iskaf in the Fatawa Nawazil of Abu Layth Samarqandi. So there we get the obligation where he says it's not permissible to cut the beard, basically. Now, what does a person do with such a mas'ala? How does a person interact with this? This is where things can sometimes get tricky. So in recent times, because usually the subcontinent ulama and a lot of the ulama in the past as well, they've held the position that the shaving of the beard is impermissible. And furthermore, we have some ibarat that state that they understand from the narration of Kitab al-Athar or Imam Muhammad, where he narrates Imam Abu Hanifa with the sanad going back to Ibn Umar, that he will hold the beard and he will trim what is underneath it. And he says, وَبِهِ نَأْخُذْ, and that's what the masla we take. Now from there, some ulama have derived the fact that it is permissible, that it is only permissible to trim up to a fist length, even though the Athar doesn't say that, nor does Imam Muhammad explicitly say it, but they say this is what is being suggested. Whereas the other reading of that text could be that it's the permissibility of trimming that's being used in the hadith, not the fist length. Whatever the case, you have no explicit ibarat from Hanafi scholars that suggest the permissibility of trimming, but explicitly say the statement that you can trim less than a fist. So you're kind of left in a bit of an issue of how do we explain this mas'ala. So if we're taking a much more rigid approach of saying, well, whatever masail comes, of course some scholars have mentioned the fist length, and we have a general obligation, therefore the obligation is for fist length, for example. That's how you want to argue it. So in recent times we saw a debate back and forth, or actually an article and then a response, right, on the topic of the beard by Sheikh Salah al-Hajj. So Sheikh Salah al-Hajj then said his method here is that, okay, we've got a mas'ala, well, let's bring it back to the usul. Why is the beard wajib? Why would the fist length be wajib? And then tell us what your illah is, and then we weigh that up with its ilal, its cause, and see what it would result in. So for example, if you were to say that the illah for the prohibition of shaving the beard is tashabbuh bin nisa, that it's imitating women, then what is the qa'idah of imitating women? What's the rule? And then try to look at similar masail in the Hanafi madhab and apply it. On the other hand, it will be that, well, it doesn't really matter, Abu Bakr is scalp, or Imam so-and-so said so, and that's all that matters. So there you have like an example where something is not explicit in Zahiri riwayah, but there can be a bit of scope of interpretation of which side to take. So therefore you can actually debate and say that when it comes to the shaving of the beard, there's more asl for it, that the prohibition of it. The fist length, there's less. And so these are, we're not going to go into as a conclusion of this, just want to highlight some of the complications. Another mas'ala, which is actually quite popular, although not so popular in the classical books of fiqh, but a lot of contemporary Hanafis are not aware of it, is the mas'ala of al-ishara bis-sababa, which is pointing with your index finger in salah. So when it comes to tashahhud, should you point or not? Now what's the situation here is that the masail of salah, or awsaf of salah, sifatu salah, whatever you want to call it, right? The descriptions of it are mentioned in the books of Zahiri riwayah. There's a bab on it. But what's not mentioned, not negated, but what's not mentioned is the pointing of the finger. Right? The pointing of the finger is not mentioned in the books of Zahiri riwayah. So therefore you have a bit of an issue here. What do we do in such a situation, considering the fact that it's not mentioned? So here, if you look on, so this is, I'm reading from the book that I mentioned earlier in the lectures, Asbab Udul Hanafiyya and Futya bi Zahiri riwayah. He first explicitly mentions by Sheikh Lu'ay Khalili, he states that in early books of the madhab like Muhit al-Burhani and Imam Laknawi, etc., they have explicitly said that this mas'ala of pointing with your index finger is not mentioned in Zahiri riwayah, right? Therefore, the Hanafi scholars were divided in whether one should point or not. So, al-qawl al-awwal, the first position was عدم الإشارة أصلا, that one should not point at all. فيبسط أصابعه من أول التشهد إلى آخره بدون عقد وإشارة عند تلفظ الشهادة. So you just leave your fingers and you don't make it into a circle, you don't make a circle, you don't point, you don't any of that. And this is a position which has been narrated by Tahawi, Jassas, Marghi, Nani. After that, Imam Aini mentioned in his commentary of Hidayah, Ghaznawi, Al-Kaki, and other scholars have mentioned this as well. And numerous people of Fatawa in the madhab have said this. It's all been referenced. If you want to refer back to this, you'll find all of this on page 466 onwards in the book. The second position, all right, which is al-qawl al-thani, which is الإشارة مع الاختلاف كيفيتها على قولين. That you should point, but how you point, there is a debate. Right? How you should point, there's a debate, and then he mentions the two positions on this. That's not relevant how. Now, what is the correct position here? So he goes, this position of pointing an index finger has been narrated from Imam Muhammad, and he says that this is a position of Abu Hanif and Abu Yusuf in his Amali. So it has come in Nawadir. Right? This mas'ala, it comes in the Nawadir. Therefore, he says, وَهُوَ الْقَوْلُ الْمُعْتَمَدَ الْمُصَحَّفِ فِي الْمَذْهَبِ. So this should be the relied upon and the corrected mas'ala in the madhab. And this is where you find numerous scholars of fatwa on this, and commented like Ghasani, Ibn Malik, Al-Aini has actually concluded on this, Ibn Humam, Al-Halabi, and numerous scholars up to Ibn Abidin, Al-Maydani, Al-Lakmi, etc. فتحصل من هذا أنه ليس للأحناف قول بالإشارة بدون عقد، بل هما قولان عدم الإشارة أصلا والإشارة مع العقد، وما مشى عليه في الدور مختار طبعا يشمل السكن مسألة. Anyway, now how do they justify these mas'ala? Right, so now the fact that it's not in Zahiri Riwayah, the absence of it being mentioned in Zahiri Riwayah, and now it's been narrated in some other riwayat which are of secondary level, should we just take the secondary level, or is the silence given some weight? So here, the first position which says you shouldn't point, it says إن في الإشارة ترك سنة اليد وهي الوضع ولأن مبنى الصلاة على السكينة والوقار فيكون الترك أولى. So now, the fact that it wasn't mentioned in Kitab al-Asl, that was for some Hanafi scholars indicative of the fact that it is not prescribed. Therefore, it's not mentioned. So now we have to find a rationale of why is that the case? Why is pointing not mentioned? So therefore, they said that we are told to place our hands in salah and to have sakina. Pointing with your finger, right? Twist your finger around, or even shaking it, right? Tahriq. Right, this goes against sakina and it goes against amr bil wada'. Right? If you look here, there's no engagement with the prophetic hadith here. It's just saying that based upon the madhab, this is how we perceive it. So therefore, one should not be pointing because it goes against the sunnatul wada', the sunnah of spreading the hands. He goes, وَيُجَابُ عَنْ هَذا. This can be responded to. That وَلَوْ كَانَ التَّرْكُ أَوْلَى لِمَا فَعَلَهُ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. Right, so that's why if this was if it's better to leave, then the Messenger of Allah ﷺ would not have done so. But it is thabit that he did so. He did. Right. Therefore, the prophetic narration alongside the nawadir, there's no need for us to take the silence of Zahiri Riwayah as evidence. So the reason I mentioned this mas'ala is that it just shows you how sometimes Hanafi scholars would even take the absence of something in Zahiri Riwayah as a strong case, even though in this one you probably most likely coincide with the contrary view. But the point being is that the absence of Zahiri Riwayah for many scholars is very indicative, if it's assumed that the mas'ala should be there, to show this is not the madhab. Right? Now, and this is not the strong case. Why? Because you have a prophetic narration and you have other riwayat establishing the ishara. But if you don't, right, that can actually be an argument to suggest that maybe this is not that necessary, or this masla was not endorsed by Imam Hanifa. Just an interesting nuance there. But this is an example of Zahiri Riwayah, masla not coming Zahiri Riwayah, and then the ulama having khilaf of how to deal with that. Right. Now, the other scenario, and hopefully we're going to spend not too long on this because it'll be quite straightforward, right, is that a mas'ala has come up and it is not discussed in the madhab. It's maskut an, right? The madhab is silent about it. So what's the hukam regarding that? Are we also expected to, are we expected to go back to Quran and Sunnah? Maybe some will be okay with that. Are we to look at other madhabs? So in all the times you see Hanafi scholars, because if you're looking at the tabaqat mujtahideen, then as we go on, as I mentioned before, the institutionalization of taqleed becomes more stronger. The amount of scholars that are engaging directly with the Quran and Sunnah are decreasing. The jurists, at least, right? The jurists are decreasing. So therefore, when it comes to a new mas'ala which is not found within a madhab, many would then just go to another madhab to see what's been said there, right? And other times they may go back to the Quran and Sunnah to directly derive it, but many will go back to another madhab and then see what is being said there, and therefore try to provide a solution like that. So for example, the Hanafi scholars have mentioned that when a person is in safar, right, of course you have a takhir, a choice, whether you want to wipe upon your khuffain for 3 days or you want to wash your feet. But the question is, ayyuhuma afdal, which one is more virtuous? Now this has not been explicitly mentioned in the madhab from Imam Abu Hanifa or anyone that wiping upon your khuf is more afdal or washing the feet is more afdal. So therefore, what does a person do in this situation? So now here, some scholars, they would have mentioned that what is more afdal. So now it's based on some form of ijtihad. He said, right, wiping upon khuf, there's no khilaf in Ahl Sunnah, but there is a khilaf outside Ahl Sunnah, meaning, so for the Shi'is, for example, they wipe on the feet. So therefore, if you're talking about wiping of khuf, there are some, even though we consider a deviant view, therefore washing will be something which is just mujma alayh. Everyone would okay with your washing of the feet. Right? So therefore, washing, if you want to have to make a decision, will be better than wiping, right, on your khuf. Others would argue that no, right, you would go with what is mentioned in, so you should actually wipe on your khuf. Why? Because this is actually demonstrating your i'tiqad, right? This is demonstrating your i'tiqad. So therefore, one should go out their way to do such an action so that they can demonstrate that this is something which is completely fine in our sharia. So therefore, they will do so. Now, I'll just give you the example. So, Ibn Nujaym says, this is what Ibn Nujaym says when he's discussing this mas'ala. He says, وَيَنْبَغِي أَنْ يَكُونَ الْمَسْحُ واجبا في مواضع منها إذا كان معه ماء لو غسل به رجليه لا يكفي وضوءه ولو مسل خفين يكفيه فإنه يتعين عليه المسح. So he goes, there's scenarios where definitely you have to wipe your feet. For example, you only have enough water that if you to wash your feet, you can't. If you just wash if you have this amount of water where you can wash your face, arms, wipe your head, right, and you can wipe your feet. But if you wash your feet, you won't do wash your face. In that situation, you must wipe over your khuf. أو لو خاف خروج الوقت لو غسل رجليه فإنه يمسح ومن إذا خاف فوت الوقوف بعرفة لو غسل رجليه. Then he goes, ولم أرى من صرح بهذا من أئمتنا. But I haven't seen anyone mention this amongst our imams. لكني رأيته في كتب الشافعية. Ibn James says, but I saw this in the Shafi'i books. وقواعدها لا تأباه. And there's nothing explicit from our principles that reject it. So our principles do not reject such an understanding. So therefore, it's fine for us to do so. Right? Another example, which is quite interesting, is the example of the absence of Isha in the summer months in the UK and such countries. So when where the Isha time doesn't begin, right, because it's perpetual twilight. In those circumstances, classically Hanafi scholars have said that Isha does not begin. There is no Isha time, right? There is no Isha time. So there is everyone says no Isha time, but there is no Isha Salah. So you can actually pray. You don't have to actually pray Isha. Other Hanafi scholars argue that you can, that Isha still remains an obligation, but they have different methods in how one would pray Isha. The idea of formulating a calculation, right, was called taqdeer. This was not something found in Hanafi books, hardly mentioned. You actually find taqdeer mentioned more in the Shafi'i text. So if you look at a lot of the Hanafi scholars today, they actually take a lot of the tafsil of the different methods of estimations based on the Shafi'i text. Right? Similar stuff is when you come with the issue of aqiqah. Imam Muhammad in his Kitab al-Athar, he negates the fact, I think it's in Muwatta, Kitab al-Athar, one of the two. He negates the mushru'iyya of aqiqah. Now later Hanafi scholars have argued that, like Alam al-Shah Kashmiri, that what he was negating was the wujub of aqiqah, not for aqiqah itself. Therefore, we can do aqiqah. But the problem is because historically the Hanafi madhab has not recognized aqiqah, the tafasil of aqiqah is not mentioned in the Hanafi text. So a lot of the tafsil of the seventh day, etc., that's taken from other madhahib. Right, so the tafsil of aqiqah that's found in English, for example, is normally taken from other madhahib. This is something which is fine if the mas'ala is maskut an within the madhab. Okay, there's a lot of flexibility there. Right, so that's quite briefly. There's a few of the scenarios that we can look at, like urf, etc., which you don't have that much time for. And to be honest, a lot of the masail that we have discussed before, the urf mas'ala is quite simple as well, for the simple fact that if the original mas'ala is based upon urf, then when urf changes and the mas'ala changes, it's very simple to understand this, right? If that is meaning, how does urf change the scenario? This is the question, right? How does urf change the scenario? If the original mas'ala is based upon urf, then urf will change the scenario. It's as simple as that, right? So if there is a let's say like a dress code that has been deemed impermissible, or a certain, a gathering, etc., deemed impermissible, and it's quite explicitly mentioned, the reason for it is because the way people were doing something, that there was an urf in that time. Therefore, the mas'ala will change with urf. People really, I think, go on about this, and there is tafsil as well, as Ibn Abdin, etc., mentions, but the base mas'ala is relatively straightforward, right? But the only thing that can be complicated is whether you can establish that there was a urf to begin with or not, right? Whether there's a urf to begin with or not. So although we were supposed to have some lectures on urf, we just kind of run out of time because our next few lectures on some other topics. So if we do carry on after in the future, we will discuss the topic of urf in more detail, because there's one other thing we want to kind of get through in this lecture, which I think is more important. Now we'll start in this section so we can go into the last section as well, and just quickly introduce this topic. Now, the modern state. So in the past we spoke about how the Islamic State had different qadis from different madhahib, or they had a qudat from one madhab, right, and they operated within that. So the Abbasid period, the multiple qudat, the main Ottoman lands, a lot of them were predominantly Hanafi, and so you have Hanafi qadis ruling by Hanafi law. What we get in the late 19th and early 20th century onwards into our day is that you begin to have the world being carved up into nation states, and the world gets carved up into nation states. So now a person's identity is with their nation, not so much with their faith, right? So a person is a Saudi, a Pakistani, a Bengali, and that comes first, and thereafter comes your recognition as a Muslim. I'm talking about on paper at least, right? So when you're a citizen of a country, the country first looks at your citizenship and nationality, and then they look at your faith, right? So if you're a Muslim living in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, then your Pakistani passport would mean more than your Islam. So therefore, if you're technically a Hindu or Sikh living in Pakistan as a Pakistani, you would enjoy certain more rights than a Muslim living in Pakistan as a non-Pakistani without Pakistani passport, for example, right? Because your identity comes based upon your citizenship, not your faith. Whereas historically, the world was divided up based upon faith, right? The way your religion is, that's how you would be basically identified. Anyway, so with the modern nation state, the state takes it upon themselves to write up a law, right? To have either a constitution or some form of law and dictate law, and it's taken away from the hands of the ulama. Right, you have these secular lawyers, etc., that use templates from French law or British law, and they write up their law. And usually in like sometimes a lot of the Muslim states, when it comes to personal law like talaq, etc., they may give it to ulama to decide how that's going to operate. But when it comes to the main, the major things that affect all Muslims on a congregational level, on a state level, then that will not be dictated to by Islam. Right, that's how a lot of these states work. Whereas others, they would try to Islamify their system, but the question is that you don't have it done under a madhab. So you don't really see people say that, for example, let's say Saudi, who claim to be an Islamic state, they won't say we follow the Hanbali madhab, right? But someone can argue, but Saudi Salafi, okay, fair enough. Pakistan, they don't, as far as I know, they don't say that they are a Pakistani, that Pakistan is a Hanafi in fiqh. Right? Yes, predominantly the people are Hanafi, and then we have an influencer, but it's not saying that the Islamic law has to be grounded within Hanafi law, and this is important. So the question is, how does a modern state, right, which doesn't allow the multiplicity of different madhab to maneuver? Because the historically you can have these various madhabs operating, but the modern state has one law, which is everyone is equal in front of that law, and it's written down. So the role, firstly, of Muslim qadis was minimized, and number two, how does this law, how are these laws implemented, right? So this is what we're going to be discussing in our last segment, written by, which will be sent to you guys inshallah, by Ibrahim. I forget his second name, but it will be shared inshallah. The name of it, I'll give it to you inshallah. So Ibrahim Fakhri, I think his name is, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so he writes a book which is called Pragmatism in Islamic Law. If you just Google that, you'll see the book, right? Pragmatism in Islamic Law. And in it, he discusses the issues that the modern state has to kind of maneuver around for it to establish its law, or for it to be in line with its, its people, who have whatever laws they're trying to implement, but also within Islam. So what you usually see is this notion of ikhtiyar that takes place. So what happens is that if we're sitting around the table and trying to establish an Islamic code, Islamic law, Islamic qanun, what you have in front of you in essence is a whole host of opinions, and even though you may base yourself on a given madhab, the state itself, because even classically the rule was hukm al-hakim rafi al-khilaf, that the hakim decides. If the hakim decides we're going to go with this law, as long as it's within the scope of ijtihad, it's mulzim, it's binding, right? Now, of course, if he takes a position which is outside of Islam, then it's not binding on Muslims to take it. Then you try to, whatever's within your capacity to not obey. لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية خالق. But if they take a valid position, حكم الحاكم رافع الخلاف. So therefore, if a state wants to adopt this position here and that position here, this madhab here, and do ikhtiyar at the end, get like an amalgamation of various opinions, there's nothing to really suggest that is no longer Islamic or is no longer binding, because it's taken from the Islamic tradition. A person can accuse it of being inconsistent, right? But and this is what a lot of these states will do, is they will say, we want to rule by this, can we find a precedence for it, or what makes the most sense, and then we'll adopt that. Right, that's the way things would work. Now that's interesting, right? But it causes a whole host of problems. Let's say, for example, right, and this is one of the modern questions which people sometimes argue there's not enough work being done upon this. And I say that the reason why a lot of work is not being done upon this, at least by scholars in the West, because no one's asking us, meaning no one's telling us that, okay, here's a situation, can you please formulate some sort of consistent laws that we can then take, that some sort of consistent laws that we can utilize for our qanun. No one's asking us, so therefore we don't really have practical solutions. We can only mention some of the complications and the problems that may come about of this. So that's what I'm trying to highlight. So it's not solutions here, because when it comes to a solution, one has to look at the history of a given country, what they have been exposed to before, what the general public are on, in terms of madhab inclinations, and then look at the economy, all sorts of things you have to look at before you can actually give a practical solution. So for us, we're just going to look at the problematizing of this issue, and we look at one case study as well, inshallah. So when a question like this comes up of what is a state meant to do in this situation, the problem that comes with this is that, let's say a state decides to take all strict positions, right? And this is one of the interesting situations of when it came to Daesh, the Islamic, the ISIS, right? Was that a lot of their opinions that they were advocating upon the Yazidis, amongst fellow Muslims, whatever, right? These very, stringent, harsh laws, etc., chopping heads off and putting on spikes, etc. They could find precedence for this within the fiqh tradition. Remember, the fiqh tradition is vast. It has all sorts of positions, right? And positions that, if a person mentioned before, or I think we're going to mention later, inshallah, is that if someone was to adopt all these positions, there'll be a zindiq, because you can take extreme positions and anomalies from everywhere, and you come across this monster that you can create. But each aspect of it, you can give a justification, right? So you can say, well, I'm allowed to do this because this madhab allows it. I can do that because that madhab allows it. I can do khamr is restricted according with these things according to the Hanafi madhab. So I'm going to do that. This madhab allows, they reckon, like the Shafi'i madhab, if a person has an illegitimate child, all right, a daughter, you can get, because it was not from marriage, that nasab is not recognized. So a person can technically marry their daughter as long as she was married, she was given birth out of wedlock, which is a crazy opinion. But let's say someone adopts that as well, then alongside this, and you can kind of come with this kind of monster that you create. So that's why these Islamic states, they can, when you kind of give this kind of free reign, you can come out with these very monstrous formulations of the Sharia, right? And that's why, and it can go for any spectrum. So it could be extremely harsh, or you can get this very lenient position as well. How does a person formulate with some sort of consistency? Now, of course, ideally, what you have is a madhab, right? Ideally, what you have is a madhab, and a madhab kind of provides some sort of consistency. But furthermore, a lot of the masail that we're talking about, which are relevant to the contemporary masses, the madhab may not have explicit statements on it, so it requires a lot of madhabi scholars to elaborate upon that. Number two is that sometimes the madhab solutions are not in line with what the government requires. So therefore, there's a lot of difficulties that come about with this. I'll give you one example. So in Pakistan, you have what is known as the blasphemy law, right? The blasphemy law. That if someone blasphemes against Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right, then there's a death penalty for them. There's a death penalty for them. So we had the case of a woman in Pakistan which was accused of blasphemy. A woman in Pakistan, she was accused of blasphemy. Asiya Bibi, I believe her name was. And one of the Pakistani politicians actually came out and said that she doesn't deserve to be, this law is being abused, and he used some very harsh language. And actually, it was by him saying so, one of the a citizen of actually one of his bodyguards actually killed him, saying that how dare you try to do away with the blasphemy law, that itself is blasphemy. Now, in that situation, for me, let's put that to aside. The question is that, is there a blasphemy law? Is there precedence for that? There's someone who blasphemes, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. So Asiya Bibi, I believe she was a Christian. So for Muslim and non-Muslim, if they blaspheme against Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, let's assume she did. Is there what's the penalty? What's the charge? And you'll find that majority of ulama say there is a death penalty. In the Hanafi madhab, right, the dominant Hanafi position here is that there isn't a death penalty if a dhimmi was to blaspheme against Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, because their faith itself is a form of blasphemy. If you're going to tolerate that, then of course blasphemy would also be deemed as part of their kufr. So therefore there's no death penalty. Now there is some tafsil where some Hanafi scholars had suggested that if it's something which is done alaniyat and loudly, continuously, there can be a death penalty, but which is done out of siyas, then like for political good or public good, it can be done. Now back to the point at hand here. So this argument was brought forth saying, well, surely as Hanafis you shouldn't. But the problem that came about here was that Pakistan has never claimed to be a Hanafi state. Pakistan has claimed to be an Islamic state. I'm not sure how good a job it's doing at that, but it's claimed to be an Islamic state. It's claimed that our constitution, etc., has to be in line with the Quran and Sunnah. Has even ulama on board to try to monitor that to some degree. But with, of course, a lot of politicians saying it's a secular state. But I'm saying is that is the claim. In this case here, where they have the blasphemy law, they can turn around and say, well, we're not Hanafi. And they're not. No one is a Hanafi. Is this found in Islamic? Is there precedence for this? Yes. So we will have this law, and hukm al-hakim rafil khilaf. Right? So the state can do ikhtiyar and choose between them and justify in that. So the question is, how does a person then deal with such a conundrum where the state is fully in charge, not the ulama. The ulama don't have the authority of deciding what is correct or not. The state decides. So if the state decides something as being morally good, or these ulama are going to decide what's the future, then that's what the future is. So what is a solution to such a question? Now it's very easy for me to sit here in the West with no one asking me. But what I would say as maybe a potential potential thoughts, which a lot of work is being done on, is that this requires a discussion and a presentation of the masail through providing ourselves with a consistency about the ethics of the Sharia. Right? That, we talk about maqasid. We haven't done a maqasid lesson here because it was not part of this initial syllabus. But if you can take an ethical based approach of saying, what does the Sharia require from us? What are the general purposes behind talaq? What are the purpose behind these laws? What they're trying to uphold, etc. And alongside that, you do alongside that, you give respect to the nusus of the madhab as well. So therefore, if you do adopt the madhab, that provides you some sort of consistency, but you have an ethical method of how you approach the madhab, where you're trying to recognize sometimes that there'll be certain places where it may not fit. So therefore, you can stretch out into other positions within the madhab or across madhabs. But throughout this point, what sometimes is lacking in a lot of these instances is that a person divorces himself from the original Quranic and prophetic message. So in the pursuit of trying to fulfill the letter of the law, we sometimes lose the spirit of the law. These are just very generic words. A lot, of course, with case studies we can actually provide more clarity here, but that blasphemy is one such example. So you say, okay, so you say dhimmi, for example, should the non-Muslim minorities in these Muslim countries be deemed as dhimmis? Right? Should the hukum of dhimmis apply to them? Are they even called dhimmis? Are the rules of dhimmi not apply? So if they are not dhimmis, right, then how does this law apply that in Hanafi madhab, for example, that dhimmis do not get the death penalty for blasphemy, for example? Right? So these are where we have a lot of difficulties when it comes to implementation. A lot of this tafsir has been discussed in the book by Pragmatism in Islamic Law by Ibrahim, I believe his name is Fakhri, I can't remember his name exactly, right? You see a lot of these details there, inshallah. I know this lecture may have been perceived as a bit, especially the last section, La yashfi ghalil, meaning doesn't quench the thirst, right? And I think there's a lot to be discussed here, but we have very small time to discuss, elaborate issues. So there are, of course, books that I'm referring to that you can reread and hopefully get a bit more insight to. Even regarding the topic of the nation state, there's a great debate about how Islam is meant to be viewed within the spectrum of the nation state. Books like what's the name, Wail Halaq's the Impossible State, the various critiques of it, counter responses about the space of Islam within the nation state, is something that we've not really delved into because we're trying to keep it more within the spectrum of the madhab, and even the case studies are meant to be case studies of the madhab. But hopefully, if we can kind of read some of these works, further clarity will be given. And there's also another book by Anwar Iman on the dhimmis, which I think is very good, in which he explains the difference between empire and the nation state, about the masail of dhimma. Right? I think it's a very good book. Anwar Iman on the if you just write Anwar Iman and the issue of the dhimmis, you'll see his book come up. It's one of the first books there on the topic, and it was really an eye opener, just to kind of explain about how the idea of the notion of discrimination and how discrimination works within Muslim states and how discrimination works in non-Muslim states. In pre-modern states and post-modern states, and the distinction between recognizing oneself based upon faith, recognizing oneself based upon citizenship, and the distinction between them. We also discussed the topic of maskut anhu in the madhab, which is a bit more easier, right? So you have a bit more flexibility to maneuver around. We saw Ibn Nujaym looking at the Shafi books and saying, we can take that as long as it coincides with our qawaid. And then we also had the mas'ala of the absence of mas'ala al-zahiri waya and the way you can engage with that. So we looked at the issue of the lihya as an example, and also the case of raf'u al-sababa, or al-ishara bil-sababa, with pointing with your index finger in salah, and the way that the scholars had navigated between that. And it shows that the absence of something zahiri waya, that for many Hanafi scholars the absence of something that should ideally be mentioned therein is actually an evidence to suggest that it's not endorsed. Even though in this scenario would say that the contrary position is more correct, but it does show you the significance of zahiri waya plays within the madhab. So hopefully that clarifies some of these points, right? We'll stop here inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.